The little girl's curious behavior. Sandra Parker, a kind-hearted woman in her late 30s, enjoyed the peaceful rhythm of her everyday life. Married to Officer Derek Parker, her days were filled with simple routines: morning coffee, working at the local elementary school as a teacher, running errands, and spending quiet evenings with her husband. Life in their suburban neighborhood was quiet, almost predictable. But recently, something odd had started happening, something Sandra couldn't explain. It began on an ordinary Thursday morning. As Sandra stepped out of the house, she noticed a little black girl standing on the sidewalk across the street. The girl looked no older than 7, her big brown eyes watching Sandra intently. Her clothes were a bit worn, but nothing seemed too out of place. Sandra assumed she was waiting for someone and didn't think much of it. She gave the girl a polite smile before getting into her car and driving off to work. Later that day, Sandra's thoughts drifted back to the little girl as she was leaving the grocery store. She spotted her again, standing near the entrance of the parking lot, those same curious eyes following her movements. Sandra paused for a moment, her brows furrowing. Was the girl following her? She brushed off the thought, convincing herself it was just a coincidence. After all, the town was small, and it wasn't unusual to see the same faces throughout the day. But over the next few days, the pattern continued. Everywhere Sandra went, the little girl was there. On Monday, she stood outside the school gates, her gaze fixed on Sandra as she greeted the children coming in for class. On Tuesday, she appeared at the park where Sandra liked to take her afternoon walks. Each time, the girl never approached, never said a word, just watched. It was unsettling, but Sandra tried to rationalize it. Maybe the girl lived nearby and was just shy. By Wednesday, Sandra couldn't ignore it anymore. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see those familiar eyes watching her. That afternoon, she sat in the car outside her house, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She had seen the girl again, this time standing right outside her front yard, staring at the house like she was waiting for something. It sent a chill down Sandra's spine. When Derek came home that evening, Sandra decided to bring it up. "Derek, have you noticed a little girl hanging around the neighborhood? She's been everywhere I go lately." Derek, always calm and logical, frowned slightly as he sat down at the dinner table. "A little girl? No, I haven't seen anyone unusual. What does she look like?" "She's small, maybe 7 years old, with curly hair and a quiet look about her. I've seen her outside the school, at the grocery store, and even near our house. It's like she's following me, but she never says anything." Derek chuckled softly, trying to ease her worry. "Sounds like she's just curious. Maybe she's shy and doesn't know how to talk to you." Sandra nodded, but her unease remained. "Maybe. But it's strange, Derek. She's always there, just watching. It feels off." Derek reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I wouldn't worry too much. If you see her again, try talking to her. Maybe she's lost or needs help." The conversation helped calm Sandra's nerves a little, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. The next day, she was more cautious, scanning the streets as she left for work. Everything seemed normal at first, but as she pulled into the school parking lot, there she was, the little girl, standing by the entrance, her eyes locked on Sandra once again. This time, Sandra decided to approach her. As she stepped out of her car, she called out, "Hi there. Are you lost? Do you need help?" The little girl didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the school building. Sandra felt a pang of frustration mixed with concern. What was going on? She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That evening, Sandra couldn't concentrate on anything. As she prepared dinner, her mind kept drifting back to the girl. Why would a child follow her so persistently without saying anything? Was she in trouble? Did she need help but didn't know how to ask? After dinner, Sandra stood by the living room window, peeking through the curtains. It was almost dark outside, but she could just make out the figure of the little girl standing at the end of the street. Her heart skipped a beat. What was this child doing out there at this hour? She turned to Derek, who was watching TV. "Derek, she's out there again." Derek glanced out the window, seeing the shadowy figure in the distance. His relaxed demeanor faded, and he stood up, walking over to the window. "Okay, that's strange. She's definitely been around too much to be a coincidence." Strange encounters continue. The next day, Sandra couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest as she went about her morning. She had agreed with Derek that she would wait for him to handle the situation, but that didn't make the uneasiness disappear. The little girl had been on her mind all night. What if she was in trouble? What if there was something seriously wrong? As Sandra drove to work, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every corner she turned, she felt those familiar eyes on her, though the girl wasn't in sight yet. When she pulled into the school parking lot, she scanned the area but didn't see the child. She sighed, half relieved and half on edge. Maybe it was just her imagination running wild after all. But that thought was short-lived. As Sandra walked through the schoolyard, she spotted the little girl again. This time, she was sitting on a bench near the playground, just watching. The sight sent a chill down Sandra's spine. The girl's presence no longer felt innocent. It was unnerving. The students ran past her, laughing and playing, completely unaware of the silent figure sitting nearby. Sandra hesitated, wanting to approach the girl again, but remembering how she had walked away the last time. "What's going on?" Sandra whispered to herself, glancing over her shoulder. No one else seemed to notice the child sitting there alone. The day dragged on with Sandra feeling distracted during her classes. She found herself peeking out the window from time to time, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl. But every time she looked, the bench was empty. Was she hiding? Was she watching from somewhere else? Sandra felt like she was losing her grip on the situation. After school, she hurried to her car, eager to get home, and talk to Derek about what to do next. She didn't see the girl in the parking lot this time, but Sandra knew she was still around. She could feel it. As she pulled into her driveway, Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. The girl wasn't there. Maybe this whole thing was finally over. She stepped out of the car, gathering her bags, but as she turned towards the house, her heart sank. There, standing by the front gate, was the little girl again. Her face was blank, but her eyes seemed deeper, sadder this time. Sandra froze. She wasn't sure what to do. She had tried talking to her, but the girl never responded. What else could she do? The girl stood there for a moment longer before turning and walking slowly down the sidewalk, just as she had done before. But this time, she didn't run away. She walked with purpose, as if leading Sandra somewhere. Sandra stood still, torn between calling out to her or letting her go. Later that evening, Derek came home to find Sandra pacing around the living room, her face filled with worry. "She was here again, Derek," Sandra said, her voice filled with frustration and fear, "right outside the house. I don't know what to do anymore. I tried talking to her, but she won't say anything." Derek sat down, his brows furrowed. "That's strange. I didn't see her on my way in. Did she just disappear again?" "She walked away, like she was waiting for me to follow her," Sandra replied. "It's like she's trying to tell me something, but I don't know what." Derek stood up and put his arm around her shoulders. "I'll handle it tomorrow. If I see her, I'll talk to her. But I don't want you to worry. She's just a kid. Maybe she's shy or scared." Sandra nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. What if something's wrong, Derek? What if she's in trouble and she doesn't know how to ask for help? Derek sighed, understanding Sandra's concern. "I'll look into it. I'll drive around the neighborhood tomorrow and see if I can find her. If she's following you, she might be hanging around here for a reason. We'll figure it out." The next morning, Derek left for work early, determined to spot the little girl and get to the bottom of things. He scanned the streets as he drove through the neighborhood, but saw no sign of her. He parked his car a block away from their house and waited, hoping she would show up. But the hours passed, and there was no trace of the girl. Derek began to wonder if Sandra had imagined the whole thing. Maybe stress was getting to her, but something deep down told him that wasn't the case. Sandra wasn't the type to get worked up over nothing. By late afternoon, Derek returned home with no answers. "I didn't see her anywhere," he told Sandra, his tone puzzled. "It's like she vanished." Sandra sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "I don't know, Derek. Maybe she's hiding. Maybe she knows you're a cop and is afraid to approach you." Derek nodded. "Maybe. But if she's in danger, we'll find out. Tomorrow, I'll talk to the neighbors, see if anyone knows who she is." That night, as they sat together on the couch, the uneasiness between them grew. Sandra couldn't stop glancing out the window, half expecting to see the girl standing there again. But the street remained empty. For now, the girl's silent plea. The following morning, Sandra felt more on edge than ever. The little girl had become more than just a mystery. She was a constant, lingering presence in Sandra's mind. Her days were consumed by the question, why was this child following her, yet never speaking? Derek, determined to solve the puzzle, had decided to take a day off work to talk to the neighbors. Sandra had given him a list of places where she had seen the girl, hoping someone nearby might know something. "I'm going to find out what's going on," Derek reassured her as they finished breakfast. "If this little girl is in trouble, we'll help her." Sandra nodded but couldn't shake her unease. As Derek left to begin his search, Sandra tried to distract herself by cleaning the house, but every little noise from outside made her pause and look out the window, hoping, or perhaps fearing, that she would see the child standing there again. Hours passed with no sign of the girl, and Sandra began to relax slightly. Maybe Derek would come back with answers, and this whole strange ordeal would come to an end. She went about her day, running errands and visiting the grocery store, and for once, the little girl was nowhere to be seen. But just as she thought things were finally returning to normal, it happened again. It was late afternoon, and Sandra was walking back to her car after buying a few groceries. She had parked in a small lot just off Main Street, and as she approached, her heart skipped a beat. The girl was standing by her car, her small figure leaning against the hood, watching Sandra silently as she walked closer. Sandra stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The girl's presence was more unsettling than ever. There was something in her eyes, something that looked like desperation. Gathering her courage, Sandra approached slowly, her voice soft but firm. "Hey there. Are you okay? Can I help you with something?" The girl didn't respond, just like before. Instead, she stood up straight and pointed towards the back of Sandra's car. Sandra followed the direction of her hand, but there was nothing unusual, just the familiar sight of her trunk and license plate. Confused, Sandra turned back to the girl, but she was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd of people on the sidewalk. Sandra felt a rush of panic. She couldn't let this moment slip away. Without thinking, she hurried after the girl, calling out, "Wait. Please, wait." But by the time she reached the corner, the girl had vanished once again. Frustrated and worried, Sandra drove home, her thoughts racing. What was the girl trying to show her? What did she want? Sandra's mind swirled with unanswered questions, but no matter how hard she tried to piece it together, nothing made sense. When Derek came home that evening, he could see the distress on Sandra's face. "What happened? Did you see her again?" he asked, his tone filled with concern. Sandra nodded, recounting the strange encounter at the grocery store. "She was standing by my car, Derek. She didn't say anything, but she pointed at the back of my car like she was trying to show me something. I looked, but there was nothing there." Derek frowned, rubbing his chin as he thought, "That's odd. Did you check to see if something was hidden or maybe stuck under the car?" Sandra shook her head. "No, I didn't think of that at the time. I don't know. It felt like she wanted me to follow her, but then she disappeared again." Derek sat down beside her, deep in thought. I talked to the neighbors today, but no one seems to know who this girl is. A few people mentioned seeing her around the neighborhood, but no one has any idea where she lives or who she belongs to. Sandra's heart sank. So, we still don't know anything. Derek nodded. Not yet, but I'll keep looking. Tomorrow, I'll check the surrounding streets and see if anyone else has seen her. Sandra sighed, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. At least they were trying. But the mystery only seemed to deepen with each passing day. That night, Sandra lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't get the image of the little girl out of her mind. The silent plea in her eyes, the way she had pointed at the car. What was she trying to say? Why wouldn't she speak? Suddenly, an idea struck her. What if the girl wasn't pointing at the car itself, but at something around it? Maybe there was something she had missed. Without waking Derek, Sandra slipped out of bed and crept down to the driveway. The night was cool, and the street was quiet. She stood by her car, staring at the spot where the girl had stood earlier that day. Slowly, she circled the car, inspecting every inch of it. At first, everything seemed normal. The tires were fine, the trunk was closed, and nothing seemed out of place. But as she crouched down to check underneath the car, her heart stopped. There, stuck to the underside of the car, was a small piece of paper. Her hand shook as she reached for it, her mind racing with questions. What could this possibly be? Pulling the paper free, Sandra stood up and unfolded it. Her eyes widened as she read the few words scribbled in a child's handwriting. Help me. Sandra's heart pounded in her chest. The girl wasn't just following her. She was trying to send a message. Something was terribly wrong, and Sandra knew she had to act fast. She rushed back into the house, her mind spinning. She had to tell Derek. The little girl needed their help, and now Sandra was more certain than ever that they were running out of time. A desperate search begins. Sandra's hands trembled as she clutched the piece of paper with the words, "Help me," scrawled on it. She hurried inside, her heart racing with fear and urgency. Derek was in the living room, reading, but when he saw her pale face, he immediately stood up. "Sandra, what happened?" Derek asked, concern etched on his face. Sandra, struggling to find her voice, handed him the crumpled note. "I found this under the car," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The girl must have left it there. She's in trouble, Derek. We need to find her." Derek's eyes scanned the note, and his expression shifted from confusion to shock. "This changes everything," he muttered. His instincts as a police officer kicked in. If this little girl was reaching out for help in such a secretive way, it meant there was something serious going on. "We can't ignore this, Sandra," Derek said, his tone firm. "But we need to be careful. We don't know what kind of danger she's in or who might be involved." Sandra nodded, her mind racing. "What do we do? How do we find her?" Derek grabbed his phone. "First, I'll call the station. I'll get back up and see if anyone else has reported a missing child in the area. If this girl is in danger, we can't waste time." While Derek made the call, Sandra paced the room, her anxiety building. She replayed every encounter she'd had with the little girl in her mind, trying to figure out if there was a clue she had missed. The girl had followed her for days, but why? Why hadn't she just spoken up? Minutes later, Derek hung up the phone. "No reports of a missing child matching her description, but I've got a few officers who can help us search the area. I'll drive around and see if I can spot her." "I'm coming with you," Sandra said, grabbing her coat. She couldn't sit still any longer. She had to help find the girl. They both knew time was of the essence. As they got into the car and pulled out of the driveway, Sandra's mind raced. What if we're too late? What if something terrible has already happened to her? Derek reached over and squeezed her hand. "We're not too late. We're going to find her, Sandra. We'll make sure she's safe." They drove through the neighborhood, scanning every street, every corner. Sandra kept her eyes peeled for any sign of the girl, hoping she would spot her familiar figure in the distance. But the streets were quiet, almost eerily so. There was no sign of the child anywhere. After what felt like hours, they turned onto a side street that was less familiar to Sandra. It was a bit rundown, with older houses and overgrown yards. As they drove slowly down the street, Sandra noticed something on the far corner of the block. There was a small figure sitting on the curb. There. Sandra pointed, her voice filled with urgency. That's her. Derek pulled the car over, and they both jumped out, approaching the girl carefully. She was sitting with her head down, her shoulders hunched, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look up as they came closer. "Hey," Derek said gently, kneeling down beside her. "We've been looking for you. Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond at first. She just stared at the ground, her body tense. Sandra knelt down on the other side, her voice soft and reassuring. "We're here to help you, sweetheart. It's okay. You're safe now." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the girl lifted her head. Her eyes, filled with fear and sadness, met Sandra's. She hesitated for a moment before speaking in a small, trembling voice. "They're going to come for me," she whispered. "I don't know where else to go." Sandra's heart broke at the sound of the girl's voice. She reached out and gently touched her hand. "Who's going to come for you? What's happening?" The girl swallowed hard, her lips quivering. "My parents. They're not my real parents. They took me. I don't know where I'm from. I don't even know my real name." Sandra gasped, her eyes widening in shock. Derek's jaw clenched, and he glanced at Sandra, his expression serious. "We need to get her somewhere safe," he said quietly. "This is bigger than we thought." "Do you know where they are now?" Derek asked the girl, trying to keep his voice calm. The girl nodded slightly, her eyes darting around as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "They're watching me. They always know where I go. That's why I couldn't talk to you. They'd find out." Derek stood up, scanning the area. "We need to get her out of here," he said firmly. "If they're watching her, we can't stay out in the open like this." Sandra nodded, gently helping the girl to her feet. "Come with us. We'll make sure you're safe," she said softly. The girl hesitated for a moment, glancing around nervously, but then she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Derek led them back to the car, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. He didn't know who these people were or how far they would go to get the girl back, but he wasn't taking any chances. As they drove away, the little girl sat quietly in the back seat, her eyes filled with fear. Sandra turned to look at her, offering a reassuring smile. "You're safe with us now. We're going to help you, no matter what." But deep down, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The unseen threat. The car ride back home was tense. Sandra kept glancing at the little girl in the rearview mirror, her heart aching with worry. The child sat silently, her small hands gripping the edge of her seat, her wide eyes darting nervously from side to side. Derek drove cautiously, his eyes scanning the road and the surroundings, as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. "Do you think they're following us?" Sandra whispered, her voice trembling. Derek kept his gaze steady on the road ahead, his tone firm but calm. "I don't know, but we can't take any chances. Once we get home, I'll call for backup. The department will help keep her safe." Sandra nodded, but her anxiety didn't ease. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, making her chest tight. As they pulled into their driveway, Derek parked the car and turned to face the little girl. "We're going inside now. You'll be safe with us, I promise," he said gently. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but then she nodded slowly. Sandra opened the back door and held out her hand, and the girl grasped it tightly, her small fingers trembling. They hurried inside, locking the doors behind them. The house, usually a place of comfort, now felt strangely unsafe. Sandra's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Who were these people the girl had spoken about? And how far would they go to take her back? Derek wasted no time. He immediately called the police station, explaining the situation in quick, urgent tones. "We need officers here as soon as possible," he said. "I'm dealing with what looks like an abduction case. The girl is safe for now, but I don't know how long we have." After hanging up the phone, Derek turned to Sandra and the girl. "Backup is on the way. We'll be safe until they arrive." But just as the words left his mouth, the lights in the house flickered. A sudden wave of fear washed over Sandra, and she froze in place. "Derek, what was that?" Derek frowned and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly to peek outside. "Could just be a power surge," he muttered, but Sandra could hear the doubt in his voice. The little girl, still clutching Sandra's hand, tugged at her sleeve. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They always do this. They cut the power before they come." Sandra's heart skipped a beat. She knelt down beside the girl, trying to keep her voice calm. "What do you mean? Who are they?" The girl swallowed hard, her eyes wide with fear. "The people who took me. They don't want anyone to find out about me. If they know I'm with you, they'll come for all of us." Derek's face hardened, and he moved quickly, checking the locks on the doors and windows. "Sandra, stay with her. I'll check outside. If something's wrong, I'll know." "Be careful," Sandra whispered, her heart pounding as she watched Derek grab his flashlight and step out into the night. She locked the door behind him and held the girl close, trying to comfort her despite her own growing fear. Outside, Derek moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he scanned the yard and the street beyond. Everything seemed still, too still. The flickering streetlight at the end of the block cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the pavement, making his pulse quicken. As Derek reached the end of the driveway, he stopped. There, parked a short distance away, was a black SUV. Its windows were tinted, and it sat ominously, as if waiting for something or someone. Derek's instincts kicked in. He slowly backed away, not taking his eyes off the vehicle. He knew they had to act fast. Whoever was in that SUV wasn't here by coincidence. Back inside, Sandra and the girl huddled together, the tension growing by the second. Sandra whispered softly, trying to keep the girl calm. "We're going to get through this. You're safe with us." But just as the words left her mouth, there was a soft thud at the window. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. She looked up, her heart racing. The thud came again, louder this time. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. Sandra grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Derek's number. It rang once before she heard the sound of his voice. "Sandra, get to the back room now. There's a car parked outside. It's them. Lock the door and don't let anyone in." Her heart pounding, Sandra nodded, even though Derek couldn't see her. "Okay," she whispered. "Hurry." She hung up, and taking the girl's hand, rushed toward the back of the house. They hurried into the small guest room, locking the door behind them. Sandra's mind was racing, trying to think of what to do next. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, and she knew they were running out of time. The girl clung to Sandra, her eyes wide with terror. "They're coming," she whispered. Sandra held her close, her mind spinning. Backup was on the way, but would they get here in time? She could hear the faint hum of the SUV's engine outside, and the footsteps seemed to echo through the house. Just as the fear threatened to overwhelm her, she heard Derek's voice through the phone, firm and steady. "Stay calm. I'm coming back. Don't open the door for anyone but me." But as the footsteps outside grew louder, Sandra knew one thing for sure. Whoever was after the little girl wasn't going to stop until they had her. Closing in. Sandra sat in the dimly lit room, her breath shallow, clutching the little girl tightly. The locked door behind them felt like a flimsy barrier between safety and danger. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by her heightened nerves. Footsteps outside the house seemed to circle, growing louder with each passing second. The little girl whispered in a trembling voice. "They're close. They always come when the lights go out." Sandra squeezed the girl's hand, trying to reassure her, even though her own heart pounded with fear. "We won't let them get you," she said softly. But deep down, she wondered if they had enough time. Would Derek make it back before whoever was outside tried to break in? Suddenly, Sandra's phone buzzed in her hand. It was Derek again. She answered quickly, whispering, "Derek, what's happening? Are you close?" "I'm almost there," Derek said, his voice low but urgent. "That black SUV, it's definitely them. I saw movement around the house." "Sandra, listen to me. Whatever happens, do not open the door until I'm inside with backup." Sandra nodded, even though she felt the walls closing in around her. "Just hurry, Derek," she whispered. The little girl was shaking beside her. Sandra could feel her fear and knew that the child had been living with this terror for far too long. The thought of what the girl had been through made Sandra's resolve harden. She had to protect her, no matter what. Outside the room, there was a loud knock on the front door. Sandra's body went rigid with fear. The knock was heavy and deliberate, not the kind of knock that came from a friend or neighbor. Whoever it was wanted them to know they were there. "Open up," a deep voice called from outside the house, muffled but commanding. "We know you have her in there. Hand her over, and no one gets hurt." Sandra's blood ran cold. She glanced at the little girl, whose face had gone pale. The child knew that voice. She had heard it before. "It's them," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "The ones who took me." Sandra felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to take this child from her. Not without a fight. Another knock, louder this time, rattled the front door. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice shouted. "Give her to us, and we'll leave you alone." Sandra quickly texted Derek. "They're at the door. Hurry." Seconds felt like hours as she waited for Derek's reply. Outside, the knocking grew more aggressive. "We don't have all night," the voice bellowed. "You don't want to make us come in there." Finally, Derek responded. "Hold tight. I'm pulling up now with backup. Stay hidden." Sandra's heart raced. She could hear movement outside the windows. Multiple people, possibly trying to find a way in. The pounding on the door intensified, and she could feel the tension building in the air. The little girl tugged at her sleeve. "They always find a way in," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "They'll hurt you." Sandra knelt down, looking the girl in the eyes. "Not this time," she said firmly. "We're not letting them take you." "Derek's almost here." There was a loud crash from the living room, and Sandra's heart leaped into her throat. The front door had been forced open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Sandra's grip tightened around the girl as she motioned for them both to stay completely silent. The intruders were inside. "We know you're here," one of the men shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. "Come out, and no one has to get hurt." Sandra's mind raced. There was no way out of the room except the door, and they were trapped inside. She had to think fast. Then she remembered Derek's advice. Stay hidden. She led the girl to the corner of the room, behind a tall dresser. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it was better than nothing. They crouched down, holding their breath, as the footsteps grew louder and closer. The men were searching room by room. They were getting closer. From outside, Sandra heard the faint sound of sirens. Relief flooded through her. Derek was here. Backup was here. But would they make it inside in time? Just as one of the intruders reached the hallway outside the guest room, there was a sudden flurry of noise from the front yard. Voices shouted, and the distinct sound of police radios crackled in the air. "Police, step away from the house." The intruder hesitated. Sandra could hear the man curse under his breath. The footsteps retreated slightly, and the house fell silent again. For a brief moment, there was a tense, frozen pause. Then the sound of heavy boots running toward the front door broke the silence. The men were trying to escape. Sandra exhaled a shaky breath. "They're leaving," she whispered to the girl, who still looked terrified. "We're safe now." Moments later, the door to the guest room burst open. But it wasn't the intruders. Derek stood in the doorway, his expression filled with relief. "Sandra, are you okay?" he asked, rushing over to her. Sandra nodded, tears of relief filling her eyes. "We're okay. But they were here. They broke in." Derek's jaw tightened. "We've got them. They're not getting away." As backup officers secured the house and took the intruders into custody, Derek knelt beside the little girl, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The girl, still trembling, looked up at Derek, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "Are they really gone?" she asked in a small voice. Derek nodded. "Yes, they're gone, and we'll make sure they never hurt you again." As the adrenaline slowly faded, Sandra realized just how close they had come to danger. But they had made it through. The little girl was safe. For now. The truth revealed. The following morning, the house was quiet, but the tension from the night before still lingered in the air. Sandra sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, her hands still shaky from everything that had happened. Derek had barely slept, keeping watch over the house until the early hours of the morning. The little girl, after finally calming down, was asleep in the guest room. As the sun rose, Derek returned from the police station with a folder of information. He set it on the table in front of Sandra, his expression serious but calm. "We need to talk," Derek said, sitting across from her. "I got some answers about what's been going on." Sandra leaned forward, her heart racing. "What did you find out? Who are those people?" Derek sighed, opening the folder and revealing several papers. "It turns out the little girl's story was true. She was taken, but it's more complicated than we thought." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Those men who broke in last night, they're part of a trafficking ring. They've been abducting children, and she was one of their targets. But there's something else." Sandra's eyes widened, her stomach twisting with dread. "What is it?" Derek looked directly at her. "The girl. She's not just any child. She was taken from a powerful family, someone with deep connections. They were hiding her, trying to keep her safe, and somehow, these men found out. They've been tracking her for months." Sandra gasped, covering her mouth in shock. "That poor child. She's been living in fear this whole time." Derek nodded. "Yes. And when she started following you, Sandra, it wasn't random. She was trying to get close to someone she thought could help her. She saw me in my uniform and thought I could protect her." Sandra felt her heart break for the little girl. All this time, the child had been looking for safety, for someone who could shield her from the terrible people chasing her. And in her innocent way, she had found it in Sandra and Derek. "What happens now?" Sandra asked softly, glancing toward the guest room where the girl was still sleeping. Derek leaned back in his chair, his face grim. "She's going to be taken into protective custody. We'll make sure she's safe, but it won't be easy. The people after her are dangerous, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Sandra's chest tightened with worry. "So, she's still in danger?" "For now, yes," Derek replied. "But the department is working on it. They're setting up a secure location where she can be kept safe until everything is sorted out." Sandra looked down at her coffee, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. "I wish we could do more," she whispered. Derek reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "You've already done more than enough, Sandra. You protected her when no one else could. You kept her safe, and because of you, we know the truth now. That's more than most people would have done." Sandra nodded, though the weight of the situation still sat heavy on her shoulders. She glanced out the window, the morning light casting soft shadows on the yard. "I just hope she'll be okay," she said quietly. Just then, they heard soft footsteps behind them. The little girl stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking uncertain. "Good morning," Sandra said gently, motioning for the girl to come over. "How are you feeling?" The girl hesitated for a moment before walking over to Sandra's side. She looked up at Derek, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice small. Derek knelt down to her level, his expression kind. "We're going to make sure you're safe," he said. "No one is going to hurt you anymore. We'll take you somewhere safe where those bad people can't find you." The girl bit her lip, looking unsure. "Will I ever see you again?" Sandra's heart ached at the question. She had grown attached to the girl in the short time they had spent together, and the thought of her leaving felt like losing a piece of herself. But she knew it was necessary to keep her safe. "We'll make sure you're okay," Sandra said, her voice soft but reassuring. "And who knows, maybe one day, when everything is safe, we can see each other again." The girl looked at Sandra, her eyes glistening with tears, but she nodded. "Okay." Later that day, the police arrived to escort the little girl to a safe house. Sandra and Derek stood on the front porch as they watched the officers gently guide the girl into the backseat of the squad car. The girl turned to look at them one last time, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Sandra smiled, waving as the car pulled away. "Take care," she whispered, though the girl was already out of sight. As the car disappeared down the street, Derek wrapped his arm around Sandra's shoulders. They stood there in silence for a while, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting. The danger had passed, but the memory of it lingered in the air. "We did the right thing," Derek said softly. Sandra nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yes, we did. I just hope she'll be okay." "She will be," Derek replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "She's a strong kid. She'll get through this." As the sun set that evening, casting warm golden light across the house, Sandra and Derek sat together in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The little girl's story was far from over, but they had given her a fighting chance. And that was enough for now.